Good morning, everyone in business law too. I thought I'd put up a quick video on chapter 20. I believe it's about employee rights. I'm sorry for the informal wear, but that's what the day calls for. We start off with union representation. Well, let's think of it in a bigger picture. Generally speaking, as an employee, many of you may not be, or many of us may not be in a situation where we have what we think of as a contract of employment for a term of years, or where the nature of the relationship is spelled out in detailed contractual terms. It's employee at will situation. And we know from the previous chapter that employer or the employee can terminate the employment at will without cause. They can just simply not like you or want to hire somebody else. That's totally permissible. But chapter 28, getting into employee rights, will make some distinctions about when that won't be allowed, because of being in a protected class and because of what we think of traditionally as discrimination. You have to be careful. Discrimination is not actually always illegal. It's often illegal, but it has to be related to a certain classification: race, color, creed, national origin, religion, age, those kinds of things, sex, in many states now, sexual orientation. Those things can't be discriminated against. However, generally speaking, employers can discriminate on other grounds, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let's start off. It starts off with union representation. Back in the, well, really throughout American history, but it really developed significantly at the turn of the 20th century. There was a recognition that big business, the robber barons of our country, although they helped build the country, there's no question about it, often took advantage of employees. There weren't things like minimum wage standards. There wasn't things like Social Security or unemployment benefits. And there was a sense that employees didn't have the ability to basically negotiate contracts at arm's length. They were at a huge disadvantage to basically the owners of the companies. And so what changed was, or what was advocated for and eventually adopted, was an expectation that there'd be a recognition of union representation to ally and gather around enough employees to make the arrangement between the employer and the employee a more equitable situation, not necessarily equal, but equitable. And so employees were allowed to unionize. And in the allowance of unionization, it was required under the National Labor Relations Law, it's required that employers have to recognize a duly certified union. What's a certified union? Basically, they you'd be working in an industry and enough people get together and say, we want to create a union, and you put it up to a vote. And if you're recognized by the workers or the employees, and that's different than supervisory employees, management, they're not entitled to be in a union. I'll get to that in a second. So if the union is recognized, now the employer they have to collectively bargain, not with any one individual, except to specific, there's still a contract between the company and the individual, but the collective bargaining contract will determine basic employment rights and duties between the employer and all employees in a like class. And it gives the employees some degree of strength because it gives you job security, but it also gives you a sense that I'm going to be treated equitably with my other employees that are doing similar like work. A lot of people don't like unions. I recognize that. And a lot of people love them. I grew up in a union family. My dad was a big union guy, so I'll tell you my bias right now. I'm kind of pro-union, but I do recognize there's huge abuses by unions. There's some things that unions sometimes fight for that seem a bit odd and ridiculous. I get it. But overall, if you really think about it, how can I, as one individual, just an everyday employee working for a large company XYZ with millions of dollars, how can I really negotiate with them to get fair wages and fair treatment and fair work conditions when it's just me alone? They can crush me. I'm an ant. But collectively, we might be able to negotiate something fair and equitable. And the government mandates that basically the employer recognize dealing with unions in the collective bargaining. Unions are on the wane a bit because the book suggests that there's something called a union contract, or a closed shop, meaning if you go to a certain job and you get hired, and if there's a union there, you'd be required to join it, even if you don't like what they stand for or what they fight for or what they promote politically. That's the strength of the union. You're saying, I can't do anything about it. I hate my union, but I've got to pay union dues. That's gone now. And it's not in your book. And the reason why, it's a fairly recent case, past couple of years. It's called the Janus decision. In the Janus decision, basically the Supreme Court of the United States says requiring an individual to join a union that often speaks about political policies and positions that are contrary to what the member actually believes in and stands for violates their First Amendment right. So Janus made it allowable for someone to go and work for a company or an industry or any type of employment to reject union membership and not have to pay union dues. Now, there's an issue if later on there's a controversy in the person's getting benefits from the collective bargaining agreement that the union fought for, they may have to pay some money for representation at hearings and things if you're trying to invoke the collective bargaining agreement. But generally speaking, the requirement that you be a member of the union and pay dues is now dead, and there's a real fear that that's going to have a backlash because a lot of people they don't support the union concept. They were just forced historically to be in it. So a lot of people worry that union membership will go on the wane. And let's face it, money talks. And if the unions don't have the money to put pressure on employers to give fair contracts, it may do some shifting in what we think of as collective bargaining agreements in the future. It's yet to be seen. But that's a Janus decision. Union representation. Generally, the law does exclude some groups from being in unions, and I already mentioned that. One is the railroad industry. They have a special provision under the Railroad Labor Act of 1947. Much of this stuff came during FDR's administration, but obviously 47 is after his administration. He died in 44, 45. But it also excludes agricultural laborers. That doesn't mean they can't unionize, but the National Labor Relations Law does not apply to the nature of the things they enter into. And government and political subdivisions, they don't have to comply with these same rules. And again, the other one, who can be a member of a union and then therefore the employer have to recognize them, it does not apply to management positions. Basically, supervisory positions are outside the union. I'll give you an example. For example, the college. Well, that was redundant. But I am an employee of the Mount Wachusett Community College. I'm a member of the faculty. There's professional staff there as well that are librarians and academic advisors and things like that. We are all employees and we're a member of a union, or we can be a member of the union. Now, because of Janus, you can opt out if you don't want to be a member of the union. However, what about the deans? Many of the deans there are or were once faculty members. Sometimes they even teach a course or two on the side, but they're no longer allowed to be members of the union, and they become professional managerial positions, and they are not members of the union, and they lose some rights. They get paid a lot more potentially, but they have a lot more responsibility, and they're no longer in the union because they're considered part of management. The National Labor Relations Board, that was created during FDR's administration, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then if there is an allegation of unfair labor practices stemming, and everyone thinks it's for the employee. It's not. Sometimes the employer is being basically, I hate to use the word railroaded, but basically treated unfairly in being coerced illegitimately by unions or employees. They can bring an action before the National Labor Relations Board. And they give you a nice list on page, I think it's 336 of your book, the different things that are prohibited, interfering with an employee's right to exercise the rights granted by law, basically to organize a union, to be in a union. You can't be penalized or treated deferentially, either favorably or discriminatorily because of your activity in union labor. Refusing to bargain collectively, the employer cannot avoid. Say, I'm not dealing with the union. I won't do it. I'll deal with all these different people individually, and I'll treat them all fair. And that might even be true, but they have to. If the union's been recognized and certified as the union rep, basically we've selected them to represent us, the employer has to deal with them. In the same with the union has the duty to collectively bargain with the employer. In good faith. Good faith means fair dealing. You're not going to do things that are fundamentally unfair to stymie, if you will, the process. You can't dominate or interfere with the administration of any labor organization. You can't contribute financial support to them because, well, why would that seem bad? Why wouldn't we want to take a donation of 10 grand from the owner of our company to help our union? Because what they're doing is they're manipulating the favorability of the union membership to maybe advance their interest vis-a-vis contracts in the future. And the other is what if a different union were to come in? They were going to try to decertify us, get a new representation, but by donating money to us, a more favorable union identity in terms of the employer's eyes, we can see how that can be fundamentally, or you're buying the union. You don't want to have that happen. And discriminating against or favoring employer, we went over that. Discriminating against employees filed charges of unfair labor practice. You can't do that. And then for the unions, what can't the unions do? They can't restrain workers or exercise their rights under the law, create coercion, picketing the employer, or forcing bargaining with an uncertified union. uncertified unions don't have the ability to do things like picketing informational lines and things like that. Refusal to bargain collectively. Yep, they've got to bargain collectively. Charging excessive initiation fees and discriminatory dues of any kind. Everyone's going to be treated equally as a union member. You can't discriminate against one group over another. Barring a worker from the union for any reason except non-payment of money. Everyone's allowed in. It's got it because otherwise it'd be fundamentally unfair. And secondary boycotts, except in the garment industry and in certain construction areas, a secondary boycott is very, very powerful. But think about it. Like say I was working for Stop and Shop, a big market chain, and they are union, I believe, and we're trying to put pressure on them to get more wages. What we do is we basically boycott or picket Bird's Eye, a big supplier of frozen vegetables to our company. And by doing that, Bird's Eye might do what? Put a lot of pressure on Stop and Shop to resolve our labor dispute with Stop and Shop. That's called a secondary boycott. They're generally illegal because it's just unfair advantage, and it's just restraint of trade. And attempts to extract payment from employers for services not rendered. And this is where unions get a lot of critique because there is some history, and I admit it, I'm a union guy, that unions would sometimes say, we want to be paid for X, Y, Z, even though we didn't do anything. That's feather bedding. There's a term for it. Basically, that's illegal. You can't negotiate for fees and monies for tasks not done. But unions had that reputation of doing that sometimes, and like everything in union employer relationships, there's been some wrongs. But overall, I think there's a recognition that the power of many versus the power of one makes it more equitable between big business and big money and the little people like me. Discrimination. Now, generally speaking, employers can discriminate against employee. Like say I go to an employer and they're a huge Red Sox fan. I come in wearing a Yankee hat. Can they discriminate against that? Yeah. What they can't discriminate, that surprises people, by the way, what they can't discriminate against, generally speaking, from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, John F. Kennedy gets all the credit for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He was dead in 1963, but it was brewing in his administration, but it was Lyndon Johnson that really pushed it through. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 basically wanted to end discrimination in employment, not for all industries, but for most. But you had to have 15 or more employees. Why? We didn't want mom and pop industries. Like say I had a small law firm, for example, and I'm going to work regularly with my employees. It's not a very big place, and I only have 5 employees. Can I discriminate? Yeah, but I can't do it in advertising in the employment positions. But could I discriminate and say, I want to work with people that I think are like me or people that don't offend me, because making people work with people they don't want to affiliate with can be very discomforting. So the federal government made a compromise and basically said larger companies, 15 or more employees that impact interstate commerce. Don't worry too much about impacting interstate commerce. Those of you that took a constitutional law class with me know that almost every kind of thing in any kind of business has a ripple effect and impacts interstate commerce. Even though you think you're just doing local work in Worcester, it has a ripple effect outside the state. It usually does. The courts have largely concluded that. So if you have 15 or more employees, you can't discriminate against, not everything. Some things you can discriminate. I don't really like really tall people. I don't like bald people. I don't like, arguably if you said redheads, you might say, well, if you're discriminating against redheads, maybe that relates to ethnicity on some level. But there's redheads in almost surprisingly in many different ethnic groups. But generally speaking, the law decided to look at things that were historically discriminated against, immutable characteristics that we think are important to make sure there's equity, not equality, but equity, fairness between all of us. And that's things like race, color, creed, national origin, religion, age, sex, and not under the federal law yet, but it might well come that way, is sexual orientation. So these kind of immutable characteristics that have a long history of discriminatory behaviors by different peoples we're trying to end. And the federal government gained that power in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Very controversial in its era. Today, I think most people recognize that people shouldn't be able to discriminate in those things. You should be able to treat people fairly. Now, is there still discrimination going on? Yes, it's illegal though. So people say, we got to stop discriminatory laws. Most laws aren't discriminatory. Most laws are designed to end discrimination. How do you prove it, though? Well, there's 2 different kinds of major discrimination. Here, first, the test under Title VII. It's they belong to one of the protected classes. So you can't say, "Oh, they're discriminating against me because I'm an avid hunter." Well, that's not a protected class. So even if you could prove they discriminate against you because you're a hunter, and there's 50 employees working there, and this company hates people who hunt, that is a valid, I shouldn't say valid, but it's a permissible type of discrimination. So it's got to be a protected class. They're discriminating because of I'm a Catholic, or because I'm Irish, or because I'm a man, or because of my age, or because um, national origin. I'm thinking of all these different things, or because I'm white. Obviously, that's not usually the case, but you get my drift. It has to be these immutable characteristics that's identified under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So you're part of that protected class. You're qualified for the job. Obviously, if they're hiring me, I hired, I want a millwright. I'm going to go work in a machine shop. I never worked on one before. Well, that's why they didn't hire me. It had nothing to do with me being Catholic. It's because I'm incompetent. So you got to prove you're actually qualified for the position. They gave you an adverse employment reaction. Either you're fired, you're terminated, or you're not hired. And it's because race, color, creed, national origin, sexual age. And the person not in the protected class got the job. So that's how you have to prove it. Very difficult to prove discrimination. And oftentimes in bigger companies, it's used by records. How many people of African American descent, applied for the position? How many were qualified? How many were hired vis-a-vis the national or the population that's in the community? Can prove it. So if you live in a community where there's, say, 30% African American population, and qualified people applied for the job, and there's 1,000 employees there, and there's not one African American that's ever been hired, what does that show? It shows a prima facie case, meaning on its face, there's a presumption that can be drawn that it must become discrimination. And that doesn't mean they win the case, but now the company would have to prove that the reason why they didn't hire anybody was for a legitimate reason. None of them were qualified that applied. The ones that did apply were up against candidates that had more skill or experience. And sometimes companies can prevail. But let's face it, if you can prove just through statistical numbers this great disparity, it's likely it's because of discrimination, whether intentional or subliminal. Sometimes it's what I call insidious discrimination. People don't really realize they're doing overtly until you look at the numbers in a company. So the two different kinds, there's one that's direct, that is intentional discrimination. We're just simply not hiring these kinds of people. That's rare and it's very difficult to prove. The other is disparate impact, meaning that all the hiring practices on paper look like they're fundamentally fair. They're objective standards, some kind of objective test. But think about it. What if I don't really like women working in my law office, as attorneys? So part of my test is you have to be able to bench press 250 pounds of the work there. Do we know that women biologically have less upper body strength than men? Yeah. And so would it have a disparate impact on women working in my firm? Sure. But what does benching weight have anything to do with running a law practice? Nothing. And so therefore it would have a disparate impact. So sometimes there have been historically tests. I know there was one many, many years ago. I remember reading there was a fire department test that tested all kinds of things that had nothing to do with what a fireman or woman would do in a position, but the test questions would be more likely passed by somebody who, well, for lack of a better way of saying it, is probably more likely to be in a Caucasian race than to be somebody of a poor economic class, which often is overrepresented by certain minority groups. And so that had a disparate impact, and it was deemed to be discriminatory, and they could sue for lost wages and or get their position, things like that. The thing that really kills these companies from discriminating isn't always the loss of money from the individual lawsuits. It's from the attorney's fees that are often applicable. Attorney's fees can be, the individual either gets the job or gets some lost wages, can be very small, but the attorney might have spent hundreds of hours on it at $400 or $500 an hour. It can be very, very expensive for a company to discriminate. And let's face it, it's in the company's best interest not to discriminate. Diversity shows that there's some degree of success, for lack of a better way of saying it, in terms of the way a diverse makeup of an employment body is. So they don't want to do it, one, for financial reasons, or two, it's morally wrong, but three, it probably behooves them, it probably benefits their company by having a diverse workforce. Now, sexual harassment, I was surprised the book didn't get more into the quid pro quo. Quid pro quo means something for something. There's two kinds of sexual harassment. Well, multiple kinds, but the two major kinds are quid pro quo. Supervisor asks, let's go with traditional one. The supervisor's a male. He has a subordinate female worker, and he asks her out on a date or something like that. The employee says no, and that's the end of it. The supervisor doesn't fire, doesn't demote, doesn't tease, doesn't harass. There's no sexual harassment there because people often do dating through employment situation. It's highly inadvisable to do that as a supervisor to a subordinate. It gives the lack of what I would consider to be a power differential situation. I would think it should be against the policy of the company, but it's not necessarily legal. What would be legal is if that supervisor, from being rejected by that woman, suddenly demotes that woman or constantly harass. Now, if the woman makes it known, I'm assuming that I'm just giving a factor, if this employee makes it known to the supervisor above them or to human resources that the discrimination is going on or this harassment, quid pro quo, something for something, you date me in exchange for keeping your job or getting a promotion or being successful at work, they notify the employer and the employer takes no corrective action. Now the company's liable. But if the company doesn't know about it, they can't be made liable. They have to have some kind of notice that sexual harassment is going on. Sexual harassment is rampant in the workforce. It's really shocking to me. I didn't work on many of these cases, but I've done some referral work to other firms, and I'm just surprised at how often it happens. The other kind of sexual harassment, I'm not talking about sexual discrimination. Let's face it, women get less pay. They don't get promoted as often. That's a whole other issue, which I'll get to in a second. The more prevalent type of sexual harassment, not that the quid pro quo isn't significant, is hostile work environment. Comments are said, imagery is posted or shared, jokes are made that create an environment. But you have to have there's two things that have to occur. One is the individual, it can be male or female. I'm just being quite frank, numerically, women are more likely to suffer from sexual harassment than men, but men do too. Actually, I knew a guy that was sexually harassed at work, and the story comes to mind. But two things have to happen. One is the individual has to feel very uncomfortable, and it's affecting their ability to work, meaningfully in the career. It's impeding their ability to be employed. Well, that's the first test. Now, are there people that are hypersensitive and maybe it's just one passing comment like, hey, you look really nice in that dress? That person might get stunned by that, feel very, very upset. Is that sexual harassment? Probably not. It has to meet the second standard. Would a reasonable person looking at the things that were said, conducted, displayed, or conversed about, would a reasonable person believe that they were harassed? And you have to meet those two tests. Now, here's an interesting caveat. What if the person, for whatever reason, they get fired, they're not doing well at the job, and they're saying, man, that place was really, really inappropriate, really body humor was going on, and people are passing around these emails that were very inappropriate. Think of the show The Office. I don't know if you'll ever watch it. There's a guy named Michael Scott who had no, real sense of propriety, and he was often saying inappropriate things. What if the person says, oh, I wasn't personally offended, but objectively it was a really hostile environment, but I thought it was hilarious and it didn't bother me at all? There's no claim. You have to be personally offended, and it has to be objectively unreasonable. But sexual harassment's really big in terms of law practices now, because not only does the person, say they have to leave the job, they can't do it anymore, they're entitled to lost wages. And if they can't find other employment, it can be a significant cost to the employer. But secondly, the thing that becomes very big is that the attorney's fees can be huge money. So you don't want to allow sexual harassment, whether it's quid pro quo or a sexually demeaning, offensive environment to allow to occur in your industry or your employment, because it's going to cost you a great deal of money. And it's just wrong. I mean, there's been a long history of it going on in many different departments, and we need to take a proactive approach to it. There's no question about it. And that goes right to the next section about the Equal Pay Act, which goes beyond sexual harassment in Title VII. The Equal Pay Act, you can't discriminate. This is a federal law. You can't discriminate based upon sex, male or female, and I would imagine soon sexual orientation, for like work, as long as it's not based upon things like seniority, experience, quality, education and things like that. So if I'm working for a company for 30 years and I have a master's degree in something in engineering, and a woman's doing a similar task to me, but she's only been with the company 3 years and she only has a bachelor's degree and I'm making more money, the company's going to be easily defending that and saying it doesn't violate the Equal Pay Act. But what if she has 5 years more experience than me? We both have master's degree in the area. She does very similar work to me, does very similar quality, has similar output, and I get paid 30% more. Well, that's what we call a prima facie case that is based upon sex. There's no other way to explain it. And the company will have to pay money to make that correct. There's a lot of evidence that women still make less. We've come a long way to be more equitable, but there's a long history of women to be discriminated against on pay, and that was the goal of the Equal Pay Act all the way from 1963. But there's been some recent impetus to beef up that law somewhat because there's concern over people being paid less money solely based on what? Sex. And again, the exceptions to it is a seniority system. Even though they're doing the same work, but the male has been there a lot longer, or vice versa. It can be discrimination against men. But let's be honest, it's largely going to be women that are discriminated against. It's just the history of it. A merit system. Someone's earned rank, for lack of a better way of saying it. Quantity or quality. He does a better job, or she does a better job. That's why she's being paid more. And any other factor that's other than sex, I don't know what they would be. It could be all kinds of things. It could be education. We just like to pay people with higher education. We have a differential for that. This guy's got a master's degree. She has a high school diploma. We pay on educational standards. We give a per diem of some kind. Age discrimination employment applies to people 40 or older. I'm older than 40. And I thought the age should be higher, discriminating against people 60 or over. But I guess when you start hitting 40, you get discriminated against. And the same thing, it prohibits arbitrary discrimination. Now, what do you mean by arbitrary? Sometimes discrimination is valid when you get older. If I went to go apply to be a firefighter at my age right now, I can't run up and down the ladder as adeptly as somebody, in their 20s or 30s even. Or even the airline industry. I believe you cannot be an airline pilot. That might have changed recently, but I think the age is 60. I think it might even be mentioned in the book. Yeah, 60 years old, you can't be an airline pilot. But why? Everything from vision to cognitive reflexes, they diminish with age. So there might be a valid reason to discriminate against because of age. But it has to be valid. It has to be valid. Same with young. There's an argument that young people think they get discriminated against, but it's not protected under this specific act, which is the Age Discrimination Employment Act. It's 40 or over. So when young people say, I'm not getting hired because I'm young, that might be a permissible method of discrimination. The Americans with Disability Act, it has to be a disability that it's not temporary, and temporary usually is, I think, up to 12 months, and it can't be broken bones, things you expect, a terrible cold, maybe even COVID wouldn't be considered to be a disability under Disabilities Act. It has to be a sort of an long-term. I believe long-term, I thought it was a year, but it might be 6 months. Oh, yeah, it's 6 months. So if it's 6 months or less, the nature of your disability, the Americans with Disability doesn't apply. It has to be a physical or mental impairment that is a major life activity. It affects something like related to seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, working, in the operation of major bodily functions, such as the immune system, normal cell growth, digestive, bowel, bladder, neurological, brain, respiratory, endocrine, reproductive functions. An impairment that is episodic or remission is a disability if it would substantially limit a major life activity past a 6-month period. It's got to be a significant problem. And two, that problem limits your ability to do the task as it was originally assigned. The employer has an obligation to do what? This is a very popular law. It has bipartisan support. I believe it was signed during George Bush the Elder back in the early 80s. Very, very popular law because people with disabilities should have an opportunity to employment, provided the employer doesn't have to do what? It doesn't cost them an unduly amount of money or effort to accommodate. So it's a reasonable accommodation. So if somebody has poor vision, they might be accommodated with an extra large display screen on their computer, or I don't know, other reading devices, or maybe a translator that does orally speaks the things that are coming in through letters and things like that. That might not be too much of a reasonable combination. Things like maybe having wheelchair accessibility for somebody who can't walk. But sometimes the accommodation is so, if am I going to hire a blind person to be a pilot? I mean, what would be the accommodation there? It would be almost impossible. And so there has to be a reasonableness test on it. And now we get into testing, polygraph tests. I don't like polygraph tests. I do a lot of criminal defense work. It's not allowed in criminal court in any way, shape, or form. People use them all the time still to try to ferret out. I don't think they're very accurate, and that's the reason why they're not allowed into criminal court. But generally speaking, the government can use polygraph tests, especially if you're working in any kind of thing that's a sensitive area. So can private industry. If you're going to be working in areas that have a lot of trade secrets or it's a security company, things like that, they can do polygraph exams on hiring. But generally speaking, they're considered to be very invasive, and they're often not allowed. And you can't discriminate against somebody not using them. And when can they use them? So you're already hired. If there's been an investigation of a specific incident of threat or destruction of property at the company, and the employer, again, provides security devices, and the employer, manufacturer, distributor dispenses drugs, there it might be appropriate, but it's pretty rare. We know government has the ability to do polygraph testing, in especially jobs that relate to security or national interests, even state interests in the police powers. AIDS testing, I don't know why it's in the book. The book's a little bit stale. That's no longer an issue. You can't do AIDS testing in most areas. It might be something where if you're working in a medical field, it might be that might be required. Drug testing has largely been upheld as appropriate, as long as it's not used for discriminatory purposes. I find that a bit surprising. I know some companies like Walmart do drug testing. I could see if you're using a forklift and things like that, but I don't always. I think it's very invasive. But the law isn't me. It's what the law says. And generally speaking, employers do have an interest in having a drug-free workforce, just for continuity of employee success and or safety. If anything ever should happen, I know if I was suing a company, I'd ask, did you drug test these employees, especially if they turn out to be positive later on after an incident. So courts have upheld random drug testing for employees in order to promote safety. I don't know, some positions that people go for to have to do drug testing. I don't know what they're fair. I don't know. I think it's a morality thing with some people. DNA testing, that comes up a little bit, mostly if it can be justified for identification purposes. Otherwise, it's considered too invasive. It gets into criminal law here, and I don't know why, but generally speaking, if you're convicted of most crimes in Massachusetts, some states even arrest, the courts have upheld that DNA testing, as long as it's kept privately, can be put in a DNA database for purposes of law enforcement for later investigations when crimes occur. I think it's invasive, not that they have to take a chunk of skin, they can do it with a saliva test, but generally speaking, the laws have been largely upheld when you have been convicted, especially if you've been convicted of a crime, especially certain classifications of crime. You usually have to submit to a DNA sample. Can't be disseminated to the world, but it's such a powerful tool when a future crime comes up to run that DNA database to pinpoint who's involved. I don't worry too much about DNA testing. Family Medical Leave Act, very important protection. Most people, everyday people like us, employers don't always like it. Employees do. It is not paid. It's up to 12 weeks. It can be extended if it has to do with somebody caring for somebody that were service members, military members. It can be basically a little over double the time, but basically it's 12 weeks of unpaid time off, and it gives you the ability to return back to work in the same position, the same title, with the same pay. Basically, they hold your slot open. It can be very expensive for an employer, not financially paying out money to you, but to basically train someone to fill your position for that 12-week period, and then you to come back and cause some efficiency issues. But let's face it, many of us have issues like the birth, the adoption, or foster care of a child. Your kid, your spouse, or your parent is seriously ill. My brother didn't take it, but he almost took it when my dad was really, really sick, and he died. And he was in the process of dying, wasn't doing it well. And so me and my brother and sister were kind of balancing, trying to help take care of him during this period of time. And my brother lived right down the street from my dad, and he was about to take the time off, and unfortunately passed away during that period of time. But it's a beautiful tool. I think it's a law, and I think it's a good law that we should be. It'd be nice if we got it with pay. In fact, the Family Medical Leave Act does provide, if you have sick time, you can take that sick time prior to the Family Medical Leave Act allowance of leave to kick in. Again, there's no pay. You have to have the ability to survive. It's just your job's held for you. And again, it's also for parents or for yourself. And I think it's a wonderful law. The law applies to public and private employees. They have to have 50 or more full-time or part-time employees for 20 weeks of the year. So it's not going to apply to very small companies because it's seen as unduly burdensome. But large organization, 50 more employees, part-time and full-time combined, for at least a 26-week period during the year, or 20-week period during the year, the employees qualify for FMLA. Great law. Employees do have to give notice that they're going to take it if they can, if it's feasible, and not foreseeable. They don't have to give notice, but if it's foreseeable, you're going to have a childbirth, your mom or dad is suffering from dementia, you're going to have to take some time off to help take care of them until things are situated. You have to give 30 days notice, if at all possibly. Otherwise, it's an emergency medical leave act. And the serious health, it can't be like, it's got to be documented. And sometimes privacy issues come up because sometimes people are taking leave because their loved one suffers from a severe mental illness, and the stigma of mental illness is very troubling. And I had to do this for a friend who needed some time off from work because of his mental illness issue was really kicking in, and they kept asking for documentation. So I worked with them, and they were pretty good about it. They said, as long as I get a doctor's note that says their condition disables them for a period of time, and they should not be able to work during this period of time, that would be sufficient. They didn't have to give this specific diagnosis. But you can imagine the difficulty. The companies do need to have justification for why you're taking the leave. It has to be a serious health impediment to you, wife, husband, child, parent, and it has to be documented. But you can imagine if it's for mental health reasons, how difficult it is to get that thing to do that. So very important. Plant closing notification, the so-called WARN law. It has to be 100 or more employees. Basically, if they're going to closing down, they have to give 60-day notice. That way it helps people look for transitional work, get ready for unemployment, and prepare for it economically, unless it's an emergency. And there are sometimes emergency situations that come up, and it's unforeseeable business event, sometimes called the faltering company exception. Sometimes companies go bankrupt overnight or really fall apart overnight. They don't have to give the notice. But generally, that's the goal of WARN. Even the acronym's trying to let us know that these large companies of 100, I think it's 100, more employees have to give 60-day notice. You're still working for the next 60 days, but there's a very strong potential you're going to be laid off. Let's face it, the earlier you know, the more whether it's going for retraining or just looking for other employment, the longer you have to stay economically afloat, the better. It's just to make fundamental fairness in these rights. The book goes into smoking. There's regulations have to be done in order to keep the safety. I don't smoke, and I used to be a bartender when I was a young person, and boy, everyone in the place I worked at smoked, and I'm sure it caused some ill health effects. And I'm glad that places of employment now are required to basically either designate as smoking areas or ban it completely, not for the health of the smokers. I don't think they really choose it. They're addicted, but for the health of us that aren't smoking. Anyways, I was a bit rambling on. I think the chapter is very clear. A lot of stuff in it. It's good stuff for us that are employees, maybe not so great for companies, but hey, they're the ones making all the profits. Talk to you soon.